let's move on and talk about another report that came out this week, which was telling something that I think many people have been looking at the gender issue for some time, wouldn't have been surprised to hear, but it's been encouraging that it's gotten so much attention. This, Claire, is the Professor Alice Sullivan-led review, which was commissioned by the Conservatives, but is now just reported back about official statistics, whether that be in relation to the criminal justice system or the healthcare system, what have you, and the way in which gender ideology and a kind of soft regime of self-ID effectively has corrupted so many different areas of official data collection, because of the fact that people were able to essentially self-identify. That's what then would be recorded. Even in relation to criminals, it'd be very easy for them to change their name and gender and therefore kind of slip through the net. The report points to loads of clear-cut consequences of this, people not being called forward for certain times of cancer screenings because they have their quote-unquote gender identity down on the records rather than their actual biological sex. But what, within this report or the discussion around it has most struck you about this?
I think it's, well, first of all, it's really great that it's come out because Alice Sullivan is, well respected in this field, and it was very exciting when it was commissioned. And when, after the general election, we had a Labour government, there was no way of knowing whether the report might disappear. And certainly a number of us have been asking in Parliament, when's the Sullivan review coming out? Because you were worried that it might not. To their credit, it's come out. Also, to the credit of Wes Streeting, he at least has said this is important and he's going to make sure that it has an impact on health statistics. But I always feel that's a bit cheaty one, because I just know that they'll say, oh yes, we do need the data to be correct on this because we don't want to misdiagnose on cancer and so on and so forth. It's a little bit, there's a lot more to it than that, because the main thing is that the collection of data is completely bonkers from any kind of level, that it depends which police force, which is your preferred data preference, right? And so some of them have self-ID, some of them do have sex at birth, some of them do not. Oh my God, it's all over the place. And then we get national crime statistics are meant to design policy. Even in then, if you think of anything, and this obviously was emerged in relation to the census, but it matters in terms of us being able to have a serious discussion about, for example, victims of female or male violence, if you know what I mean. You've got to know, well, were they men or are they men? There's very well documented cases where there's been media panics over the past. Radio 4 indulged in one where they said there was a big spike, this was some years ago, a big spike in women as sexual perpetrators. And the truth is, they then admitted that they didn't necessarily use the category woman in the sense of biological sex. So the problem then is that you can't know one way or another, because it might well be, by the way, that biological women are becoming perpetrators in terms of child abuse. Let's find out if that's significant. But of course, nobody knows that, and everyone suspects, because they backed off that story because they said, oh yes, the data might not be reliable. So what Professor Sullivan has done is, I think, invaluable, that it's gone through quite seriously all the different ways that we need reliable data and we're not getting it. And although I'm not keen on the notion of evidence-based policy, because I always think policy needs more than evidence. If we're going to have evidence, can we make sure it's reliable? And to have to listen to all those politicians saying, this is evidence-based policy, then you say, how did you collect the data on sex and gender? And they go, there's always somebody raising the culture wars issue. You want to politicize. You're so frustrating. So I'm delighted.
It comes back to that thing, just how this has become an argument over actually what actual reality is and whether or not that should be fudged for the sake of ideology or hurt feelings. Was there anything that struck you about this report in the write-up, Josh? There's so many crazy examples.
Oh yeah, I mean there was the one that really stood out when I was reading it, like just blew my mind, was that a woman was allowed to change her baby's sex, and went back to the GP and said, no, was raising the baby at like a few months old in a different sex, and went back to the GP and said, I want a different number, and to put him or her down as a different sex, and the GP did it. And social services weren't called, and this is child abuse. And I imagine the GP was either just utterly ignorant, which surprised me, or just was afraid, and that was most likely to it and went, oh, I don't want to kick up a fuss here. And this poor child, let's have some follow up. Let's find out what's happened to this poor kid. So that's the danger, just one of many dangers. But to see it, as you were saying, like, look, this is stuff people have been in these kind of arguments for years, have sort of seen bit by bit, the NHS bit here, the police here, to have it all collated together is a good thing. To have it then put towards the public so they can understand what's going on. And we have a data hole here of sort of a decade or so of data does matter. It was a deliberate obfuscation by ideologues to deliberately mix up the word gender and sex. And now it's kind of like when we look back in history, historians will look at this 10 years and won't be able to sort of make not just like the madness of it, but just will actually look at figures and facts and whatnot, and just will go, oh, well, that was that decade, so it's the lost decade of ideology.
There'll have to be big asterisks next to it. Like they went mad for a period here.
But
Female penises, etc.
I think the sad thing is that so many people have had their careers and reputations trashed because they asked these very sensible questions just about data. And so there has been cancellations, but there's, obviously that was partly, Joe Phoenix as a criminologist started off thinking about these things through that prism. Alice Sullivan herself, has been called out, as it were, in attempts to discredit her. I just don't think it's quite over yet. It's a great relief that we're here. But one of the things is the way that media codes carry on instructing newspapers. And I mean, it's just utterly bonkers where you have that situation where you can now have the correct data, but you're still told this woman has just gone round filming in toilets and so on and so forth. And you think, it's not a woman, it's a man. But they refuse to do it. So there's still this sense of being gaslit all the time. Yeah. And I think it's worth noting that at the heart of the system, in the civil service, in Whitehall, in all of these places, these people actively pursued this policy of confusion around data because they argue for evidence-based policy and then try to distort what the evidence said.
And it's not just that people not being held to account. It's that it's still going on. The government hasn't come out and said, "Oh, this is terrible. We're going to fix this."
Exactly.
That's the other.
We have accepted the report, etc., etc. From bureaucrats,
they're not actually acknowledging.
It could disappear. This report.
Yeah. And it's So exactly. This stuff is still going to continue. So maybe it's another 10 years until they finally actually get on top of it.